It began when the HOA proudly unveiled a brand new luxury neighborhood called Maple Ridge, a place that gleamed beneath the morning sun as if it had been painted straight from a dream. 96 homes lined in perfect symmetry, each roof reflecting gold light, every blade of grass trimmed like it had never known wind or dust. People came from nearby towns just to look at it, to take pictures by the grand entrance arch where banners fluttered in a soft breeze. Smiling families waved. Cameras clicked. Cars rolled slowly past, no one noticing the single man standing across the road, hands in his pockets, eyes steady and quiet. His name was Daniel Cross, and though he looked like any ordinary man lost in thought, the ground beneath that perfect neighborhood had once belonged entirely to him. 40 acres of soil, his father's soil, turned into concrete and profit, and no one knew, not the builders, not the smiling homeowners, that the man watching them had once planted corn there, had buried his dog under the big oak that now stood chopped and paved over by a roundabout. Daniel watched in silence, not out of weakness, but because he had already screamed once and no one listened. He had learned that sometimes quiet could cut deeper than noise. Years ago, when Daniel's father passed, the land had been everything he had left: old fences, a broken barn, and papers tucked away in a rusted lockbox. He didn't understand all the terms back then. He just knew it was theirs, the Cross farm, a legacy stretching back to his grandfather who bought it with war pay and hope. But when the developers came, they came smiling, promising roads, schools, and opportunity. They told him his signature was just a formality, a minor process to update the boundary lines. He had signed nothing. Yet one day a letter came saying the sale was complete, the land transferred, his own name replaced by a corporation's. When he protested, the clerk shrugged, saying the documents were clear, and the lawyer who handled the transaction vanished into another state. Daniel tried to fight, but money and law had a way of making truth disappear. He lost the appeal, lost his house, and watched machines roll across his father's field, digging into the dirt where he once played barefoot as a boy. The sound of bulldozers felt like thunder in his bones, and still he said nothing, because rage without proof was noise, and Daniel preferred silence that remembered. He moved into a rented trailer miles away, fixing fences for other farms, sometimes hauling hay, sometimes working night shifts at a lumber mill. No one knew his story, and he never told it, but every time he drove past Maple Ridge, he slowed down. The place looked different with each visit. First open fields, then steel skeletons of homes, then families laughing in driveways. Each visit pressed another bruise into his heart, but beneath the hurt was a strange calm, a patience that came from knowing time could bend. He kept every paper, every map, every note from the old days. He kept them not for revenge, but because something inside him whispered that the truth never stays buried forever. It just waits for the right wind. Sometimes on quiet evenings he'd sit by his small table, sipping weak coffee, flipping through the old deeds, tracing the edge of his father's handwriting with his finger, remembering how his dad once said, "Land isn't just dirt, son, it's memory." And Daniel understood now what he meant, because every inch of Maple Ridge was built on his memory, on his family's sweat. Yet they treated it like just another real estate venture, like numbers and profit margins could erase generations of life. He smiled bitterly at the thought, folded the papers again, and tucked them into a metal box under the floorboard. One day, he promised quietly, one day when the right moment comes, I'll make them see. Years passed, Maple Ridge grew, the HOA became powerful, a symbol of luxury living. They held meetings about fence colors and garden heights, unaware that their empire stood on stolen soil. Daniel remained invisible, a ghost in the town where he once was known. But fate has a strange way of circling back. It was a spring afternoon when he heard on the radio that the HOA president was planning to expand, buying nearby farmland for another phase of homes. Curiosity pricked at him. He visited the county records office out of habit, pretending to look for work permits, and that's when he saw it. A familiar name typed neatly on the document. The same lawyer who had stolen his land years ago, still working, still handling the deals for the HOA. His hands trembled slightly as he took a copy, his heartbeat steady but heavy. All the silence he'd stored inside began to hum like a distant storm, not rage, just a deep, quiet certainty that his time had come. That night, Daniel returned to his old barn, now leaning and covered in ivy. The air smelled of old wood and dust. He pulled out his flashlight and started searching through boxes until he found the tin one, Inside were the deeds, yellowed and cracked, the signatures clear under lamplight. One of them written in a style that was never his, the looped letters too fancy, too unlike the way he wrote his own name. He compared them side by side, laid them flat. The forgery glared back at him as if mocking, but instead of anger, Daniel felt something different, relief, because now he wasn't chasing ghosts, he had proof. He took photographs, made copies, and stored the originals safely again. The world outside was silent. Only the wind whistled through the gaps in the barn's wood. It almost sounded like his father whispering, "Took you long enough, son." In the following weeks, Daniel kept his calm routine, still working, still quiet, but now with purpose hidden behind each look. He watched the HOA with quiet eyes. The president, a woman named Linda Mayfield, known for her sharp tongue and iron smile, was organizing a grand community gala to celebrate Maple Ridge's 10 years of excellence. The local paper called it a night of pride, success, and leadership, but Daniel read it as arrogance printed in gold. He circled the date in red ink on his calendar, his mind not driven by vengeance but by justice long delayed. He had no intention of shouting or begging, no need for pity. He wanted the law to speak for him. The same law that once ignored him would now be forced to listen, because silence, when timed right, can be thunder. He spent nights rehearsing what to say, not words of anger but truth stripped bare. He pictured standing before them, all those faces that looked down on him years ago, now forced to hear his name again, not as a victim but as the rightful owner. Each evening he imagined walking through those fancy streets where he once herded cattle, imagined the look in their eyes when they learned the homes they loved so dearly stood on stolen ground. The thought didn't bring joy, only closure, and maybe peace. The days leading to the gala were slow but charged. Like the calm before a storm, Daniel fixed his old truck, cleaned his only suit, polished the shoes he hadn't worn since his father's funeral, and on the morning of the event, he looked at himself in the mirror, lines on his face deeper now, eyes calm and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen loss and learned patience. He whispered softly, "Let them see," before stepping out. As he drove toward Maple Ridge, the streets buzzed with cars and laughter. The new neighborhood sparkled with lights strung across porches, music playing from hidden speakers. The HOA banners fluttered again, this time celebrating 10 years of success built on silence. Daniel parked far from the main gate, stepped out, and looked once more at the land that had shaped his life. The air felt heavy, like it remembered him. The soil beneath his boots seemed to hum faintly. Maybe memory never really leaves. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the envelope. A clean, white envelope with the county seal. Inside it were not threats or demands, but something far more powerful. A summons from the court, official and undeniable. He didn't need to fight in the streets or argue in meetings. His weapon was truth wrapped in paper. A voice that the system could no longer ignore. He stood still for a moment, watching the families entering the hall, laughter echoing, glasses clinking. He thought about all the times he could have given up, all the nights he wanted to burn everything and vanish, but he had waited, and now, in this quiet moment, he knew his silence was finally ending. The moon climbed higher as he walked across the parking lot, his reflection flickering in car windows, each step steady, each breath calm. And though the music from the hall grew louder, inside Daniel felt nothing but stillness, because he knew this was the beginning, not of revenge, but of reckoning. And as he approached the door of the shining community center, the same words whispered again in his mind, soft as wind but sharp as truth. Silence was never surrender, it was preparation, and tonight, the world was about to find out what that meant. The barn creaked like it remembered every year of pain Daniel had buried inside it, dust rising in thin silver trails as he opened the old door that night, the air heavy with the scent of soil and rusted tools. His flashlight cut through the dark, landing on the wooden table where time itself seemed to have stopped, boxes stacked high, some labeled in his father's faded handwriting, others left blank, like secrets never told. He sat down slowly, the wooden chair groaning beneath him, his rough hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the tin box he had hidden for years under a pile of rotting tarps. Inside lay the story of his stolen life, folded papers yellowed by time, maps smudged with his father's fingerprints, and the deed that once proved the Cross family owned every inch of that land. He pulled them out carefully, like a priest handling relics, and stared at his father's signature. Strong, proud, honest. Then at the one that had replaced it, curled and elegant, too smooth, too practiced, the forged signature that had taken everything from him. A single line of ink that destroyed generations of work. He felt his chest tighten, not with rage but sorrow so deep it felt like grief reborn. He remembered the day his father first showed him those documents, telling him, "Land isn't something you own, son. It's something that owns you back." And now the land that had once embraced him had been sold like a lie, turned into driveways and mailboxes. The thought hit him like a hammer, and for a long while he couldn't move. He just sat there, listening to the quiet breathing of the night, the wind outside whispering through the cracks like ghosts passing through old bones. He stayed that way until the sound of a passing car broke the silence, its headlights flickering across the barn walls, lighting up a photograph pinned to the beam. His father in overalls, smiling beside the first tractor they ever bought. Daniel stood slowly, walked over, and touched the frame with the tips of his fingers, the glass cold beneath his hand. "I'm sorry, Dad." He whispered, voice rough from years of dust and silence. "I let them take what was yours." But the apology turned into something else, a promise, one that burned quietly inside him like an ember, because in that moment he knew what he had to do. He was done being quiet, not with noise or violence, but with proof, truth sharper than any weapon. He turned back to the table and began organizing the documents, every paper, every receipt, every piece of evidence that tied the land to his family. He noticed something he hadn't before, a letter from his father's lawyer, never opened, sealed tight, the paper inside. Brittle with age, when he finally unfolded it, his breath caught. It wasn't just legal notes, it was a letter his father wrote before he died. "If you ever read this, Danny," it began, "it means I'm gone, and the land's future rests on your shoulders. Don't trust the ones who smile too easily. Protect what's ours, even if the world calls you foolish for it." His father had known something, maybe even sensed the betrayal before it happened. Daniel's eyes burned as he folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket, and whispered, "I'll protect it, Dad, even if it's too late." He spent the next morning at the county archives, a building he hadn't entered in almost 15 years. The clerk didn't recognize him, just smiled politely when he asked for property records from the year his land was sold. "That's a long time ago," she said, typing on her computer. "You sure you remember the parcel number?" He nodded, his memory still sharp, the numbers carved into his mind from endless nights of staring at the papers. She handed him a file, and there it was, the same. Lawyer's name printed neatly on the transfer sheet. His name connected to both the old deed and the new development. His signature appearing not once but 3 times. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just theft, it was a pattern. A quiet web of lies spun under everyone's noses. He asked for copies. The clerk made them, her face curious but kind. "Are you reopening an old case?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Something like that," then walked out into the sunlight, clutching the papers tight. The warmth on his face feeling different this time, not comforting, but like a spotlight on truth that had waited too long in the dark. That evening, as he spread the documents across his small kitchen table, the pieces began to fit together like a puzzle, each one a silent witness to what had been done. The HOA president's name appeared again and again, attached to permits, zoning requests, construction approvals, all signed by the same crooked lawyer who once told him, "You'll get what's fair, Daniel." Fair, he thought bitterly, fair was what thieves said to those they robbed when they wanted to sound polite. He leaned back, staring at the stack of evidence that could finally speak where he had been silenced. But something in him still hesitated. Years of disappointment had taught him that truth alone wasn't always enough. It needed timing, power, and the right stage, and that's when he saw it. A small article in the local paper announcing Maple Ridge's 10-year gala, a celebration for the HOA's commitment to honesty, excellence, and community. The irony almost made him laugh, because he knew exactly who would be there. The president, the lawyer, the board, all in one place, all sitting together, unknowing that the man they stole from was still standing, still breathing, and ready to make them look into the mirror they avoided for so long. He folded the papers neatly, slid them into an envelope, and wrote 3 words on the front, "For the court's eyes," his handwriting calm and steady, no anger left, just a quiet purpose that came from knowing patience had finally paid off. Outside, the sky turned gold as the sun sank behind the hills that used to be his, and Daniel stepped out onto the porch, the wind brushing against his face, the sound of leaves moving softly through the trees that had survived the bulldozers. For a long moment he just stood there, breathing, feeling, remembering. The silence around him no longer heavy but alive, filled with the promise of what was coming. The truth was no longer a memory locked away in his barn. It was now a storm quietly forming on the horizon, and Daniel Cross, the man the world forgot, was about to remind them that silence can roar when the right moment arrives. The night of the gala came dressed in gold and laughter. The new community hall of Maple Ridge shimmered with warm lights that bounced off the polished marble floor. Music floated through the air like perfume, soft and elegant, the kind meant to make people forget how hard truth can be. Men in sharp suits and women in sparkling dresses filled the place, talking about property values, school rankings, and garden competitions. Not one of them remembered the dirt beneath their feet, the history buried under it, the lives erased to build their perfect little world. But Daniel Cross remembered, and as he stood outside under the cold wind, he could see the same lights that once blinded him with loss now shining like a challenge. He adjusted the collar of his old suit, one his father had worn to church years ago, the fabric rough but clean, and with a quiet breath he walked toward the entrance, no invitation in his hand, just an envelope, thick, official, and heavier than anything he had ever carried before. The security guard looked up, ready to turn him away, but Daniel's calm gaze made the man hesitate. "I'm here for someone," he said simply, his voice steady. "They're expecting me, even if they don't know it yet." The guard frowned, but, seeing nothing threatening about the gray-haired man with the calm eyes, stepped aside. Daniel crossed the threshold into the light. The smell of expensive wine and polished wood filled his lungs, laughter clinked through crystal glasses, and the air felt too rich, too false, every smile painted on like a mask. At the center of the room stood the HOA president, Linda Mayfield. Wearing a red dress that sparkled like arrogance itself, she held a glass in one hand and the microphone in the other. Her voice filled the room, cheerful, proud, hollow. "Tonight we celebrate 10 years of Maple Ridge, a symbol of unity, trust, and progress." The words stabbed at Daniel like cold needles. He walked further in, slow steps on the glossy floor, his boots echoing softly. Some people turned to look, confused at the stranger who didn't belong, but he didn't care. His eyes locked on Linda. She noticed him midway through her speech. Her smile faltered for a second, confusion flickering into annoyance. Daniel reached the front of the crowd, stopped and simply said, "It's beautiful what you built here." His tone calm, almost kind. "But I wonder, Mrs. Mayfield, do you ever think about the ground beneath it?" Her expression froze. The crowd went quiet, all eyes turning, whispers spreading like cracks in glass. "Excuse me?" she said sharply, the microphone trembling just slightly in her manicured hand. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze soft but cutting. "You built your dream on stolen land?" he said quietly. "My land." The silence that followed was alive, thick and heavy. Someone in the back laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Daniel didn't smile. He reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope, the official seal glinting under the chandelier light. "This is from the county court," he said, holding it out to her. "You'll want to read it before you make your next speech." Linda hesitated, her eyes darting to the lawyer standing near the buffet table, the same man who had forged Daniel's life away years ago. His face turned pale as he recognized him. The crowd murmured, the music stopped, and the tension hung so sharp it could have sliced through stone. Daniel handed her the envelope and turned to leave. No drama, no shouting, just quiet certainty in every step. Behind him Linda tore the seal open, her hands shaking as she read the words. "Property dispute hearing scheduled. All construction and financial activities suspended pending investigation." Her voice caught. The lawyer rushed to her side, trying to whisper, but the damage was already done. The people around them began whispering louder, questions spreading like wildfire. "What's happening? What land? Who is he?" And through it all, Daniel kept walking toward the door, his shadow long under the golden lights, his face calm, almost peaceful, as if the weight he had carried for decades had finally started to lift. Outside, the night was colder, quieter, the music replaced by the sound of wind against the flagpoles. Daniel walked to his truck parked across the street, stopped once to look back at the glowing building. Through the glass he could see the chaos beginning, people crowding around Linda, the lawyer trying to explain. But truth doesn't wait for comfort. It comes like a storm, slow, steady, unstoppable. Daniel started his engine but didn't drive off yet. He just sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing deeply, feeling his heart beat slow and steady. The land stretched out behind the hall, invisible in the dark but alive in his memory. He could almost hear his father's voice again, quiet and proud, saying, "You did right, son." He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with something softer, peace mixed with pain, because justice always comes late. But when it does, it comes like dawn, and as the first cold raindrops hit his windshield, Daniel whispered to the night, "I'm not finished yet," then drove away, leaving behind a celebration that had turned into a reckoning. The courthouse smelled of rain and old paper the morning Daniel Cross walked in, the sound of his boots echoing softly against marble floors that had seen 1,000 stories of justice and betrayal before his, but none quite like this one. The hallways buzzed with quiet murmurs, reporters whispering to each other, cameras ready, homeowners from Maple Ridge filling the benches, their faces pale with worry, some angry, some confused, none of them understanding how the ground beneath their perfect homes had suddenly turned into a battlefield of truth. Daniel walked past them slowly, his old coat still damp from the storm, his expression calm, but his eyes carried decades of silence that had finally found a voice. When he entered the courtroom, the HOA board sat together, like frightened schoolchildren, their lawyer beside them. The same man who had once smiled while stealing his land, now fidgeting with his tie, avoiding his gaze. Daniel took his seat across from them, setting down the worn folder filled with documents. It wasn't a weapon, but it felt like one, because in that folder lived every lie they ever wrote. The judge entered, her voice firm yet calm. "This hearing is now in session." And as the words echoed, Daniel felt his heartbeat steady. The lawyer began first, his voice slick and polished, trying to sound confident, painting Daniel as a bitter old farmer clinging to the past. "Your Honor," he said, smiling for the crowd. "Mr. Cross is confused about ownership history. The land was legally purchased, all procedures were followed, but his words faltered when the judge interrupted. "Mr. Cross, do you have evidence to the contrary?" Daniel stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He nodded once, then opened his folder and spread the papers across the table, each one placed carefully like stepping stones over a river of lies. "This," he said quietly, holding up the original deed, "was my father's, signed and notarized in 1972. This," he continued, showing the forged one, "is the document they used to take it away. Same notary stamp, same lawyer's name, but look closely. The date on this stamp doesn't exist. It says February 29th on a year that wasn't a leap year." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Gasps whispered from the benches. The judge leaned forward, inspecting the paper herself. The lawyer stammered, his voice suddenly smaller. That must be a clerical error." Daniel's eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "An error that stole 40 acres from a family?" The judge looked up, her tone sharp now. "Mr. Lowell," she said to the lawyer, "this isn't a clerical error, this is forgery." Silence fell again, thick enough to choke on. Daniel felt his chest tighten, but not with anger, with something deeper. A strange ache that came when justice finally began to move. The HOA president Linda tried to stand, trembling, her voice shaking. "We didn't know. We bought the land fair and square. We had no idea." Daniel turned to her slowly, his voice steady. "You didn't want to know." The words cut through her excuses like a blade, and for a moment even she couldn't find air. The judge raised her hand for quiet, flipping through the evidence. Every page another nail sealing the truth, and then she spoke, clear and cold. "This court recognizes Mr. Cross as the lawful owner of the land known as Maple Ridge Estates, All developments are hereby declared invalid until restitution and ownership matters are resolved. A stunned silence followed, then chaos, homeowners crying out, reporters rushing to their phones, the HOA lawyer collapsing back into his chair. Defeated. Daniel stood there unmoving, as if his body didn't quite believe what his ears heard. The judge's words echoing softly in the hollow of his heart. All those years of being ignored, mocked, dismissed as nothing. All of it now washed clean by a single truth laid bare. Linda looked at him, her eyes wet, whispering something that sounded like "I'm sorry." But he only shook his head. "You're sorry because you got caught," he said quietly, no cruelty in his tone, only exhaustion. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes again. The judge banged the gavel once more, the sound sharp, final, like thunder rolling through the bones of the building. "Case adjourned," she said. And with that, the silence that Daniel had carried for so long finally broke. Not with a shout, not with triumph, but with the simple, quiet sound of peace returning to a man who had waited far too long to breathe freely. As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Cross, what will you do now that you've won?" one asked breathlessly. Daniel stopped at the steps, the gray sky spreading above like a canvas of memory. He looked down at the courthouse steps wet with rain, then at the small patch of mud on his boot, and said softly, "I'm going home." Nothing more, because there was nothing left to prove. His silence had spoken louder than any protest ever could, and as he walked down those steps, the wind carried his father's words again, faint but certain. "You did right, son, you brought it back." And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to smile, small and weary, but real, because justice might come slow. But when it comes, it never forgets its way home. The news spread like wildfire through the town, headlines flashing across every screen. Local farmer wins land back from HOA in historic case. Reporters called it justice, homeowners called it disaster, and the HOA called it betrayal. But for Daniel Cross it was simply the truth finally breathing again after years trapped under concrete and silence. He didn't celebrate, he didn't shout. He just stood at the edge of the courthouse parking lot and watched people scatter. Their voices loud, desperate, begging lawyers to fix what couldn't be fixed. Some homeowners wept because their houses, their lives, their savings were built on someone else's stolen ground. And Daniel watched with heavy eyes, not out of cruelty but sorrow, because none of them had meant to be part of the theft. They had just trusted the wrong hands, just like he once did, when a stranger smiled and said, "Sign here." He felt the strange pull of empathy, but it didn't erase the truth. The land belonged to him now, not because he fought harder, but because patience had waited longer, and the law had finally remembered his name. Days turned into weeks, and Maple Ridge transformed from a proud community into a ghost town of uncertainty. Homeowners began leaving, lawsuits piled up, the HOA office stood dark, its sign torn down by angry residents demanding answers. The lawyer who forged the papers vanished overnight, leaving behind a trail of broken promises, and Linda Mayfield, once the queen of the neighborhood, was now a figure hiding behind drawn curtains. Her empire reduced to rubble built on lies. Daniel drove by. Only once, the silence there felt strange, like justice had swept through and taken all the noise with it. Half-built homes stood empty, lawns overgrown, the air heavy with shame and quiet regret. He parked his truck by the entrance sign, the same one that once made him feel powerless, and stared at the words Maple Ridge Community, carved in polished stone. His reflection shimmered faintly in its surface, the face of a man who had lost everything and somehow gained it back without lifting his voice. He pulled out a small knife from his pocket, the same one his father had used to carve fence posts, and scratched 3 words beneath the shiny letters. "Truth always returns." The next day, the judge's final decision came through, the verdict now permanent, the HOA's appeal denied. The land was officially his. All 96 homes sitting on property that legally belonged to Daniel Cross. The county offered compensation from the HOA's remaining funds. Lawyers begged him to sell the land back to the developers, offering millions, but he refused every offer, saying only, "You can't buy back respect." And though the media chased him for interviews, he never gave any. He just smiled politely and walked away, because the story wasn't about fame. It was about peace, and peace, he knew, was something that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Daniel returned to the open fields that once were his father's farm. Weeds covered the ground where concrete had cracked, driveways split apart by time and neglect, nature quietly reclaiming what was hers. He walked to the center of the field, the air cool and still, the smell of rain rising from the dirt, and for the first time in decades, it felt like home again. He knelt down and pressed his hand to the soil, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his fingers, the same heartbeat that had once fed his family. He closed his eyes and whispered softly, "We're back, Dad." His voice breaking just slightly, the wind moved gently across the field, brushing against his face like a hand from the past. It was quiet, sacred, almost holy. He stayed like that for a long time, not thinking of revenge or victory, just the memory of every step that had led him here. Every night spent wondering if silence had been a mistake, and now realizing it had been his strength all along. In that moment he understood that justice wasn't about destroying others. It was about restoring what should have never been taken. He stood again, wiping the dirt from his hands, his heart calm and full. The land stretched before him like an old friend smiling through scars, broken but alive. When he left that evening, the horizon glowed with the last light of day, and in the reflection of his truck window, he could see the faint image of his father beside him, proud, silent, smiling the way he used to after a long day in the fields. Daniel whispered, "It's done," and drove away without looking back, because the land didn't need to see him anymore to know he'd returned. It already felt him in every root, every grain of dirt, every gust of wind moving through the grass that now grew. Free again, and as he disappeared down the empty road, the sign of Maple Ridge stood behind him, cracked and weathered, the letters slowly fading, as if even the name itself was ready to let go and rest. Months passed and the land began to heal. The noise that once filled Maple Ridge was gone now, replaced by the soft hum of wind brushing through tall grass that had pushed through broken concrete. Rainwater pooled where driveways once shined. Wildflowers grew along the old sidewalks, and the ghosts of laughter and lawnmowers faded into the earth. Daniel Cross came back every morning just to walk the field, not as an owner seeking control, but as a son visiting a father's memory. The place no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like what it was always meant to be, home, raw and quiet, breathing again. The county had sent him papers to finalize the deed transfer, and one gray morning he stood in front of the courthouse again. The same steps where his life had changed. This time without cameras, without reporters, just him and the sound of his boots on wet stone. The clerk smiled gently as she handed him the final document. "Congratulations, Mr. Cross," she said softly. "It's all yours again." He nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he took it. Not from weakness but from the weight of the moment, years of silence, loss, and patience all folding into a single line of ink that read Owner, Daniel Cross. He stepped outside and stood under the cloudy sky, the paper clutched in his weathered hands. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then harder, soaking his coat and hat, but he didn't move. He let it fall, feeling every drop like forgiveness washing through the years. Down the hill he could see the empty stretch of his land, the soil dark and shining under the rain, and he smiled faintly, because it wasn't the same as before. It was better. It was free. He drove there one last time that evening, parking near where the old oak once stood, the one his father had planted before Daniel was even born. He dug into the back of his truck and pulled out a small sapling, just a young tree with roots wrapped in burlap, something new to begin again. He knelt and dug into the soft earth, his hands dirty, his breath heavy, the smell of soil rising like an old song, and as he placed the sapling in the ground he whispered, "For you, Dad, and for all the years they tried to bury us." His voice cracked, but his smile held steady. The rain fell harder, running down his face, mixing with tears he didn't bother to hide. The world around him blurred into color and memory, but in that small patch of earth, life began again. When he finally stood, the sun was breaking through the clouds, light spilling over the land like gold returning to what was once taken. He looked at the little tree swaying gently in the breeze and felt peace in a way he hadn't known in years, not the peace of victory, but the peace of coming home. The wind moved through the grass, whispering across the open field, and in it he could almost hear his father's laugh, low and proud. As if the land itself was saying welcome back, Daniel stayed. There until the light faded, watching the sky change colors, orange to violet to deep blue. The kind of beauty that doesn't need witnesses. He knew he'd rebuild someday. Maybe a small house, maybe just a barn. But for now, the silence was enough. The land didn't need walls or fences. It needed time, just like he did. As night fell, he sat by the small fire he built, staring into the flames, the sound of crickets filling the air. He pulled out the final deed from his pocket, folded it once, and held it close to his chest, whispering softly, "We made it." And as he closed his eyes, he remembered everything. The lies, the laughter, the storm, the courtroom, the faces that doubted him, and the single moment the judge called his name and gave him back what was his. That memory shone brighter than the fire, because it wasn't about land anymore. It was about dignity, about keeping faith when the world thought you were defeated, about proving that silence isn't weakness. It's the breath before thunder. He leaned back, the stars appearing one by one, his heart full and still, the wind carrying the scent of new grass, and somewhere in that vast quiet field, Daniel Cross finally found what he had been chasing all those years. Not revenge, not justice, but peace, pure and simple, growing from the same soil that once broke his heart, now holding it whole again.